Gideon versus Wainwright, Changing the Approach to the Public Defense System. Introduction. The Clarence Gideon case began on June 3, 1961, when an unknown person broke into a Panama City pool hall and committed a minor theft. On the same day, a witness told police that he saw Clarence Gideon outside the billiard room at approximately 5:30 a.m. with a bottle of wine and money in a bag. Police arrested Gideon, who was charged with breaking with intent to commit petty theft. Appearing in court, Gideon asked to be assigned a defense attorney, citing the U.S. Supreme Court's decision and his lack of funds to hire one. In 1942, the U.S. Supreme Court in Betts v. Brady ruled that a court may appoint counsel for a defendant if he suffers from a physical or mental impairment or if the case has exceptional circumstances. These grounds were not present in the case, and under Florida law, an attorney could only be assigned if the person was charged with a capital offense. The jury found Gideon guilty, and he was sentenced to prison. However, Gideon filed a petition for review of his case with the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court issued a fundamentally important decision that has enormously impacted U.S. jurisprudence. Case outline. Name of the case: Gideon v. Wainwright, 372 U.S. 335, 1963. Facts of the case. Gideon was convicted by a jury and sentenced to imprisonment. The Florida Supreme Court rejected Gideon's appeal. While in prison, Gideon prepared and filed a petition with the U.S. Supreme Court to have his case reviewed. The petition was granted, and the case was subject to review by the Supreme Court while Abe Fortas was appointed to represent Gideon. A hearing was held on January 15, 1963, and a final decision was rendered on March 18, 1963. The justices of the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously decided to review Betts v. Brady. The justices concluded that counsel should be appointed to a defendant who cannot retain counsel in any criminal prosecution. History of the case. Under Florida law, an attorney could be appointed exclusively if a person was charged with a capital offense. Once the case was decided, it became an ordinance requiring the presence of a line of defense in all cases. Differences in state approaches to providing access to counsel were eliminated, and the prior statutes were repealed in Florida. Legal questions. Gideon v. Wainwright was part of the Supreme Court's pioneering approach to criminal justice in the 1950s and 1960s. The court was deciding the principle of Sixth Amendment compliance because the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment applied critical provisions of the Bill of Rights against the states. The court argued that the Sixth Amendment requires a state to provide defense attorneys when necessary because such attorneys are essential to a fair trial. Decision. The decision was made unanimously in favor of Gideon at the hearing and the appeal. Subsequent to the Supreme Court's decision, Gideon was acquitted by a jury of the crime against Wainwright. The underlying circumstances of Gideon's arrest, besides his being near the crime scene, were not present. The main reason for the first guilty verdict was the lack of a line of defense, taking away the defendant's right to a fair trial. The final judgment considered the defendant's inability to exercise his statutory rights, which led to the need to reconsider the decision and allow Gideon to receive quality defense. Verdict and opinion. The decision of the Supreme Court was unanimous and made by Justice Hugo Black. Judges Clark and Harlan wrote two concurring opinions, while Judge Douglas wrote a separate statement. Justice Douglas insisted that access to counsel is a necessity in all democracies, not a luxury that only a select few can afford. Equality before the courts has always been one of the most considered issues in U.S. Supreme Court jurisprudence. Still, it cannot be realized if not everyone has the opportunity to defend themselves. The right to be heard is meaningless without the prior opportunity to be heard by counsel. Even the most educated person lacks the experience and skills to argue their case and build a proper defense. Harlan emphasized that a severe charge is an indisputable condition for access to counsel. The Sixth Amendment of the Constitution does not distinguish between cases, and the defendant needs legal counsel in all cases. Conclusion. The decision, in this case, is still considered one of the most fundamental because it fundamentally changed the approach to the public defense system. It brought about many changes that demonstrated the need to hire general attorneys to help needy people. Such people were immediately hired in all of Florida's circuit courts, and the need for criminal justice training to ensure the principle of fair justice became clear. Before this case was decided, states were free to interpret the right of access to counsel, thereby restricting people's civil rights and liberties. However, after the final Supreme Court trial, the right to counsel became mandatory, with the only exception being the defendant's ability to waive it. Thus, state residents could access the same level of protection, regardless of their money or any other assets. It was unequivocally the right thing to do and promoted a fair trial for all residents. As a result of the case, the old rules were replaced by firm procedural safeguards guaranteeing acceptable practices and due process.